Everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be the Game Week 20 cheat sheet. We're looking at a game week that is quite interesting because I feel like a lot of transfers are forced upon managers this week because of suspension related issues. And then on top of that, there's also the idea that we're quite close to the double now. Double transfers probably are going to be taking place around Game Week 23 because that's a really good game week for Liverpool. So if you haven't been already invested into triple Liverpool, that's a good time to do that. But before that, these few game weeks left, we're still looking at investing into quite a few teams that have good fixture runs in the upcoming, which would be, let's say, teams like Newcastle, Crystal Palace, even arguably United, but that really starts from Game Week 21 because Game Week 20 is the all terrible fixture, right? Liverpool away. And when it comes to, let's say, a team like Arsenal, it's potentially, once again, these types of game weeks are looking like potential launching off points. Now, the defense still looks wonderful for Arsenal, but I'd still say the offense looks rather subpar. And this was to be expected because of Saka leaving, but they've still been able to ship some goals, for example, in Brentford's way, I suppose. And we've seen that they've been able to score 3 goals. So promising signs even in a Saka-less world. So let's quickly jump into the cheat sheet. We're starting with the midfielders as usual. If you've never seen the cheat sheet series before, it's one where I rank all the players in FPL based on their price point and their positions. And we try to sort of assess their quality when it comes to the next few game weeks, so 3 to 5 fixtures in a row, whilst contextualizing the data in open play, as well as, you know, the intangibles that I'm looking at myself, set pieces, penalties, their minutes more crucially, and also some of the outcome from the season, some of the production seen. So starting from the midfielders, I think the budget midfield has taken a lot of movements. The new players are Paqueta, Dibbling, and Elanga. So I'll talk about all 3 of these players. So Elanga has benefited a little bit from, you know, Cho not playing too much football, but he's been the form player really for Nottingham Forest, right? We usually associate Wood with being the player who's the most interesting when it comes to, let's say, if you see Nottingham Forest score a goal, who do you think is going to show up on live score and flash score? Probably Chris Wood, but Elanga has been quite productive as of late. His underlying stats aren't great, but historically, I'd say that his underlyings have been really impressive. So if he's allowed to get more minutes, I always have a little bit more confidence in him than someone like Cho, who kind of has that finesse shot in his locker, but is quite an unproductive player, if I can say that. Whereas Elanga is quite interesting for me. There's also Morgan White, Elliot Anderson, all players who are playing really well, but Elanga would be the one who interests at this sort of price point. I still think he's a massive differential though, because you're also looking at competition in his position and ultimately lack of minute certainty going forwards. As far as Dibbling, I do like him for this price point and specifically for this price point. A Southampton attacker is not something that we really love, but I would say that it does seem like they're playing much better football under Ivan Juric, which is actually really nice. And Dibbling, I was quite shocked to see that wasn't playing too many minutes in the first 2 games under the management of Ivan Juric. Subbed off at 45 minutes in the first, barely played really in the second game, but then in the third one, had his breakout game, scored a goal as well. And I do think Dibbling is someone that I find to be a very good player. I do think that when you look at the fixtures, Game Week 20 is quite a nice jumping on point for Dibbling here. But if you have no interest really in, let's say, Dibbling, and you, let's say, have only 2 functional strikers, there's no reason to move into a Dibbling type team. Dibbling is sort of a player that you go for if you're trying to go for a 3-4-3. So very, very specific type of player. With Paqueta, I do think his minutes and all the attacking minutes should be, you know, on the up, right? Kudus should be playing more minutes. Somerville should be playing more minutes. Yes, Fulkrug is back in the team and can be playing more minutes, but I would say Paqueta sort of is somewhat benefited from Bowen leaving the team, in that I find it harder to believe he's going to be an earlier substitution, as he's probably going to be quite an important player over this run and just going to get more minutes as a result of that. And as a penalty taker, he does have an intrinsic value, right? Not to the same level of Kluivert, because you can't really compare the quality of attack that West Ham have compared to Bournemouth, particularly a West Ham Bowenless attack and a very functional, for the most part of this season, Bournemouth attack. So when you look at Kluivert and him getting a rise, that's because of, you know, the faith that I have within this Bournemouth team. They've drawn the most penalties this season. Whether I think that that's something that's going to repeat itself, you know, maybe not, right? Maybe they won't be on that same sort of pace, but still, Generally speaking, I'd say good level offenses usually get into the box more, have more actions in the box, and therefore you're going to imply more penalties. And Kluivert, still with the amount of injuries that they have at Bournemouth right now, is going to be benefiting from that. Amad Diallo gets a drop. I think United have just looked absolutely awful recently. His underlines, as I've always mentioned, are a little bit worse than some of the other sort of elite picks that you can see. And it also really depends on that positional share. Now, fortunately, with Garnacho and Rashford not getting much minutes, it does seem like Ahmad gets really easy share of the 10. But I do think that it's arguable to say that because the team's been playing so poorly, you still might see chopping and changing of the team. I don't think Amad Diallo is going to suffer, but we're just not seeing too much really from the offensive point of view from United to really be enjoying them. And particularly some of that comes from lack of, I guess, functional creative build-up from these fullbacks playing wing-back positions and therefore not correctly supporting these 10s who should be thriving a lot more in this Amorim structure. But without, key players like, let's say, Ugarte playing in certain games, you don't get to see that. And so, yeah, that's a concern. I think United will probably be investing more in the transfer window. And I think that the knock-on impact with an overall improvement in squad quality should help Amad Diallo. But yeah, probably not a pick that I absolutely love right now, just because of how poor United have been over the last few matches and how it really has soured, I think, from the beginning of, let's say, the Amorim tenure, these sort of baselines for United. As far as these sort of top tier picks, no real changes. I'm hesitant to make Murphy a green pick, even though Newcastle have been playing really well. And more importantly, Murphy has played more minutes of football, which is a hugely positive sign. We if you look at historically with Eddie Howe's tenure, when a side is playing well, you will see those players get played every single week. And with less football that they have to get invested into, Murphy's minutes should be better. But I still always hold out for the possibility that Barnes is a good enough player to be taking very good minutes away from Murphy. And that sort of is that capping off of the ceiling of Murphy. Because when we look at the non-penalty expected goal involvement stats, yes, of course, Murphy seems like he's the absolute king of this position. But we do need to contextualize that he has been, first of all, farming, I suppose, a lot of these weaker teams when he's been getting good minutes. And second of all, he doesn't play that many minutes compared to some of the other elite picks like a Semenyo and a Sarr. And I still think this applies to Rodgers, who, yes, of course, at times you see him get subbed off at 65 minutes, something like that. But for the most part, if a game is competitive and in the balance, we tend to see Rodgers play 85, 90 minutes a game. And that's really it. Iwobi gets a drop as well. Yes, of course, he has an amazing game coming up next in game week 20, but I still think that those underlying numbers are poor. The minutes are good enough, and that's sort of my overall concern with Fulham. It's probably not that worth it to go for players like Iwobi when you have other players playing similar minutes and ultimately have that much more of a ceiling overall, considering that Iwobi has gotten so many price rises. That's the key thing that I find interesting with Iwobi, that I think at 5.9 million, you're starting to say possibly that he's overpriced. Whereas obviously if he was a 5.5 million pick, slightly different sort of consideration there. And it's just take into that sort of context. In the next tier, we have an Eze rise and a Martinelli rise. And I think both of these really come down to the recent minutes that both players have played. We did think that, yes, Arsenal attackers that are non-Saka are going to benefit from Saka being injured, because you're just going to give more minutes to Jesus, Martinelli, Havertz, and Trossard. Now, we've seen Trossard get benched. We've also seen Havertz out of the squad, which probably allowed for more minutes for players like Jesus and Martinelli overall. But Martinelli has played really good minutes, and I do think that he's probably more likely than, let's say, Trossard, for example, to get really consistent minutes over this tenure, and we've already seen that come into fruition. I don't think the underlying stats for Martinelli are that impressive, right? They're actually quite poor, and he's not on set pieces unless, let's say, Rice is out of the team. So if Rice is out of the team, Martinelli does take left-sided corners, which is actually a huge benefit. But that's all I really have to say about Martinelli. I still think he's a very strong pick. And for that reason, of course, he gets a very deserved rise with the amount of minutes that he's played recently. With Eze, yes, of course, he scored a goal. Sarr had better underlying stats that game, but we can't assess things on a game-to-game basis. Over the course of the season, Sarr has actually produced more in open play than Eze, and that's true. But Eze still has some sort of low, I guess, percentage chance of taking penalties, and that has to be taken into account, right? The more fit Eze gets, the more minutes I think on average he plays compared to Mateta, who is generally speaking the less fit player, although you can argue less injury prone as well on the flip side. But Eze also takes other things like set pieces, which I think actually add to the overall value of the player without being able to reference purely to open play stats like NPXGI. So that's something that I would probably mention. The reason why I mention that is because set pieces, sometimes a player like Saka can get great expected assists because you can see how consistently they sort of land these chances in terms of very consistent good headers in the box for Arsenal. But as a set piece taker, you could really just be benefiting from assists from corners, which I think Crystal Palace have gotten a lot from. And on top of that too, I think one of the benefits of Eze is it's the amount of actions that he does that are positive for bonus. So you could see, for example, how good the bonus baselines were when he scored a goal within the previous match. And I think that's something that's also reflected in terms of when you take set piece actions and things like that. So a very bonus friendly player as long as he gets a return in FPL. Kudus gets an introduction, Mitoma gets a drop, and that's mostly due to the benching, but also specifically Brighton's fixture run once again getting worse compared to, let's say, some of the other runs that other players have. I would like to give Kulusevski a rise, but I do find that, yes, market improvement this season in terms of the open play numbers, but honestly, generally in production as well. But I still think that he's not someone you're looking for specifically from an FPL point of view. Yes, Kulusevski is probably their best player, their most important player, but this game as well is also just purely about sort of outcomes and sort of looking for goals and assists for the most part if you're looking for an attacker. So I think the interesting thing and a good sort of reflection of that is someone like, let's say, Maddison, who has not been playing very well this season, hasn't gotten the same amount of minutes, has gotten a lot of returns, mostly due to overperformance, to be honest. Or someone like Son, for example, who, if you're visually watching him, hasn't been playing well at all, but actually has really good baselines this season for whatever reason. And so sometimes it's a funny little thing in FPL where, unfortunately, Kulusevski doesn't really benefit from being the good player that he is. As far as interesting, actually, market increase in production this season, I think he's just going to be more important for this West Ham side and going to have more minutes overall anyways with Bowen's absence. And I would say he's the player that I have the most faith in terms of producing sort of positive attacking outcomes for this West Ham team going forward. So that's why I do like introducing Kudush into the cheat sheet. And the next tier, we have a rise for Mbumo and Gordon stay at the top. We did give Gordon a rise last week, even though the fixture on paper looked a little bit worse, just from the defensive point of view of United. But, Gordon was impressive once again, and his underlying stats are also really impressive. More so because the minutes are there compared to some of the Liverpool players who have really good underlying stats. And also, he's very XG dominant, right? So if you want to make the historical comparison, I guess a well-performing Rashford is the type of player that I would make that comparison to, right? Rashford is a little bit more goal dominant compared to some of the other players here who are very balanced in terms of XG and XA split. Gordon is very direct as a player and is very XG dominant. So I do love Gordon a lot, and for that reason, he is still, for me, the top pick here. And Mbumo gets a rise because you're taking almost one bad game off the calendar with the Arsenal fixture where he still scored from a very, very low quality chance, I'd say, and probably a mistake overall from Raya, but it just shows you the quality of Mbumo as a player. Whatever is going on this season, he is showing massive overperformance, and that happens, right? This is arguably, I suppose, the reflection of a player in form. Foden last season was like that. 2 seasons ago, we had Odegaard as someone who was sort of constantly overperforming. Maddison is very much like this this season, so is Mbumo, which is why when you look at the underlying stats, Mbumo is worse than some of the 6-point X's that I've mentioned, but he crucially does play all the minutes. He is on penalties, and at the end of the day, is a very high quality finisher, as the season has shown. So he's overperformed a lot and ultimately has Southampton away. I just think he's one of those picks in FPL where he's just so tried, he's so trusted that you like having him in your team. And it's always going to be tough to sell Mbumo. I'm still thinking about generally selling Mbumo later down the line. I'm sure people will think it's stupid, but we do actually have some more options now within the midfield, which I like. And I think that's positive for, almost like structural diversity within FPL teams. And it's nice that Mbumo is one of those competing picks as usual. With Luis Diaz, he gets an introduction to the cheat sheet. Yes, he is a great player. And honestly, the improvement under Slot is visible, but mostly the improvement is finishing, right? When you look at the underlying stats, he's exactly where he was at last season with Klopp. But the big difference is he's finishing his chances, and maybe the style of football could be conducive to that. I think it just is just a reflection, to be quite honest, of how up and down players' seasons can be, right? Not so many players are consistently overperforming or consistently underperforming. And so Luis Diaz is a good reflection of a sort of player who sort of you can meet in the middle, where over the course of his career, he'll have a down season, he'll have an up season, but he's a very productive player regardless. And it always comes down to minutes. And I still think it's very hard to judge whether the minutes will go towards the right players on the right fixtures. And so for Liverpool players, I still have to find that their differentials at the sort of price point they're at. For Maddison, this applies equally. So I've always been very against Maddison as a pick. He's performed really well, and it's not that I have an intrinsic bias against him, but it's always about, can I reasonably predict that, particularly since Maddison isn't well rated by Ange and isn't going to get the minutes that I think he deserves, arguably, or doesn't deserve. Ultimately, he's just not getting the minutes, and it's very hard to foresee a very consistent rate of returns from a player like that, because you're almost saying that you're going to rely on that continuous overperformance from a player. And whilst that could be applicable to someone like Jota, who's been a historical career overperformance, so is Maddison, it's also about the rate of overperformance. It's normal for players to probably, score above average chances, right? Like 20, 30% of the time, but to do so 100% more than what you usually do is a little bit different. And Maddison is someone who's, close to that level of production right now. So yeah, I still don't really like him as a pick. As far as the next tier, I've dropped Odegaard because I don't have huge concerns with Odegaard, but I did see him lose corners to Nwaneri, which is not great, right? Nwaneri had an overall decent performance. I think people were probably, I guess, gassing up the performance because he's a young wonder kid, and I totally appreciate that. He's a very technically gifted player. You can see that already, but losing corners, I think, is more significant, and that's why I've given Odegaard a soft drop here. I still think he's on penalties. The underlying stats have always been bad. We know that, but the Arsenal fixture run is still good, and it's not like he is super far off, for example, the likes of an Mbumo, or super far off the likes of, let's say, even a Martinelli who just scored in the previous match. So yes, he is someone who sort of sits on the edge of the box. He does drop deep sometimes to be a DLP, but it doesn't really matter. I still think that Odegaard is getting enough sort of production in there, and overall the minutes have been good so far. So I think with Odegaard, he's one of those picks where I would probably let him see out fixtures like the Brighton game and the Tottenham game, the combination of the two, and then you can reassess afterwards. If you want to sell him now immediately to someone who's like, let's say, a green tier asset, I also think that's fine, because it's probably, once again, a consideration of how you want to redistribute the funds in your team. But I still find Odegaard to be a very fair and fine hold. As far as Foden and Son, they both get drops to me. Foden playing less minutes, which is sort of what we expected over some of these kind of congested fixtures, is crucial. And I think overall, just the performance of Foden and Son this season has been really poor. So there's always been a question about the minutes of these players, and what the manager will give them. So I'm not saying that McCarthy is going to suddenly just play and start over Foden, but we're starting to see, I suppose, desperation, to be quite honest, from players or from managers like Pep, and even Ange as well, with the overall poor Son performance. And I think we're just going to see naturally less minutes from these players, and they're probably fine sells, because so many of the players who are the best midfield picks right now are so close in terms of level of production, like Eze, Martinelli, Gordon, and Mbumo, to these players, that I don't think it's really worth the price point. It's just fortunate that we have found ourselves in a situation where we don't need to be spending that sort of level of money for someone like Bukayo Saka, who gives you that consistency and level of production, but he's not in the game, and you can kind of spend the money how you see fit. Moving on to the next position, we have the forwards, and João Pedro gets a rise again. And I think you're probably going to see that I'm maybe overreacting to performance, but I'm also sort of reacting to the fixture landscape and ultimately what I would call the meta structure. So last week I suggested the idea that people could be moving to a 3-5-2, but at the same time, it doesn't seem like Odegaard and Bruno really are commanding a lot of our money. So therefore, it probably also means that you can actually still hold someone like João Pedro quite easily into your team. And I still think he probably fits into some of the better team structures there are around, particularly if you have extra cash. So I think it was probably a mistake on my part to drop João Pedro, knowing that his minutes are so good, that he still has some intrinsic value within the game. And for that reason, he gets a rise once again, because we also know that he's a penalty taker, which is going to be a plus. And if Welbeck comes back, I generally do think that João Pedro is best when he's playing at the 10. But the minutes that he's been getting is still super impressive, right? There was still probably a chance that if with Welbeck out, that you'd see other players take minutes away from João Pedro. But with mass substitutions being used over all these matches, random benchings being included, he still has stayed perfect when it comes to minutes. And I think that's why he deserves a rise. As far as Raul, he gets a rise because the fixture's good. And I still think that he's going to be one of those players where every week where I might feel like I should be dropping him or increasing him. And I'm sure a lot of people will find that a little bit tough to sit with as an idea. I think the issue is going to be that ultimately there's been the center forwards have had good competition, and sometimes of course they underperform. Sometimes you see them get benched, rotated even for fitness reasons, and Raul will never make it past 65 70 minutes, I think, as long as Muniz is fit and available. We also have Carlos Vinicius, and so I do think Raul is going to start a game like Ipswich at home, and I think that is always a kind of opportunity for someone as an FPL manager to just move into Raul if they don't really care about that 8th attacker in their team, and Raul represents that. But you can maybe optimize around Ipswich at home when you need someone to play within your team. And this week, a lot of us are desperate for that 8th attacker because of that Rodgers suspension, or that Ahmad has a poor game, or even let's say Sarr arguably has a worse game too. So that's something to talk about. Armstrong's minutes have sort of been wavering, but I still find him to be a reasonable pick at that sort of price point and penalties. I've added Tall Paul Onuachu here. He's played minutes recently, but I still think that this is very specific to a situation, once again, like that Raul spot, where you don't want to be spending too much money on your 8th attacker, but you still want to be, I guess, spending above Stewart. And Onuachu might be able to give you some minutes. He has some decent fixtures where, for example, on a game like this, you feel like you can have an Onuachu playing as your 8th attacker because no one else has a really good fixture. With Ndiaye, he's being added, even though I wouldn't really recommend him as a transfer in the short term, because he's the only forward within this Everton team, forward from an FPL point of view. He's not really a forward in real life, but forward from an FPL point of view that is actually getting consistent minutes from Everton. Right now, I think with Broja fit, he's starting to get some minutes. Beto can be a substitute at times, and Calvert-Lewin just isn't producing anything. So you've got 3 strikers really who aren't producing anything. I think there's going to be rotation between all of them. Ndiaye is like the one player who is interesting, but clearly, as you can see, the baselines are absolutely horrible. So there's no reason to really be invested into Ndiaye unless you, let's say, have free transfers around the double and you want to make a transfer then, or you don't even care about that spot in general. So unfortunately, I do think that 8th attacker spot right now in FPL is being a little bit redundant, but then that also shows you the strength of João Pedro at the end of the day. With Delap, he gets introduced, but I think the fixtures are still quite iffy for Ipswich. I do like Delap a lot, and potentially he should be a yellow pick or deserving of yellow pick, because we finally have confirmation of him being on penalties, but he's always been on penalties, but the underlying stats are also really, really poor. So I think that's something to just, reflect on and kind of consider at that sort of price point. In the next tier, we have Wood getting a rise, and this is similar to the João Pedro rise, where we're losing a lot of options within the game, right? Cunha is about to embark on a poor run of fixtures. The same applies to Strand Larson. A lot of the movements within the fixture landscape and a lot of the movements within sort of the midfield landscape mean that we probably still want to be moving into, let's say, a second forward. And Wood or Jesus is a good second forward alongside Isak, particularly for those who are maybe trying to use Jackson as a cash cow and trying to sell someone like Jackson. So I can understand the appeal of a Wood and a Jesus for now. These are players who have good games over the next 3. Jesus more so, because I think that game week 21 is a tough fixture for Wood, but Jesus doesn't really have a tough game week 21. So you can kind of look at these players as short-term punts and bargains, and if they work out, you can keep them long-term. If not, you can also shift them on to someone else a little bit cheaper later down the line, and you really feel like there's not too much regret, because I don't think you necessarily need to be stretching back towards Jackson later down the line, right? If you're looking at the next few tiers, we'll talk about Jackson in a moment, but even within the next tier, I've given Solanke a drop because I do think that the next 3 games aren't particularly good. As far as, let's say, Gakpo, he's been added, but for the same reason as why I can't really move any of the Liverpool midfielders above that sort of differential position, Gakpo will also suffer from the same consequences, because even though the minutes have been good in terms of he's getting starts, he's getting subbed off at 65 minutes, I think people do need to contextualize that, right? Because yes, he's produced, but the underlying stats aren't miraculous for someone who's playing 65, 67 minutes a game. And that sort of shows you why Gakpo probably isn't really worth his price point for me. But you never know, because the idea of these Liverpool players, as well as what happens around the double, or what happens if there's an injury, if Jota gets injured, or if Diaz gets injured, suddenly these players are amazing. And so it's always just worth keeping that in mind. And I'm sure a lot of people want to also punt on these great fixtures, right? Like Man United at home. So there is a bit of an appeal, I think, and people like to talk about it as being upside, but I think you also need to give credit to the players in the Premier League who actually play very consistent minutes, who are on penalties like Wood, or even these Arsenal players, right, who play for a much inferior attacking team but still have much better minutes because of the exclusion of Saka and what that means for all these other players. So that's sort of my little short diatribe for Liverpool attackers, which I still don't love, but they could be interesting when we get to the double. As far as, let's say, Havertz, there's an asterisk around him. I still think Havertz is actually going to play really good minutes, but I could be wrong. There might be situations going forward where you can see Havertz get, you know, or like, for example, within the cup game versus Crystal Palace, you can see situations where Havertz can get benched. And we've already seen him get benched one time this season. But I will say that if you exclude the illness game, he's still, for the most part, this season played 82 minutes per game. So he's been a very important player for Arteta, but Jesus has obviously shown that he's brought a lot to the squad, particularly with Saka's absence. So there's a bit of a balance there, and I still think Havertz is a very strong pick. With Watkins and Jackson, I haven't really moved them. Watkins, clearly, we knew specifically for the punt of Game Week 19 and 20 was going to be an amazing asset, particularly even arguably a green asset, which is what I talked about. But you also need to know that when you invest into, let's say, the combination of, let's say, Isak plus Watkins or Isak plus Jackson, suddenly you're sort of pricing yourself out of some of the interesting midfielders within the game, which I think is a little bit of an opportunity cost. So with Watkins, I think the big question mark is going to be when Duran comes back in Game Week 21, how much of his minutes are going to be impacted? And for me, that's a question that I probably wasn't prepared to answer because I didn't have 3 or 4 free transfers. But for the people who do, that's a very different circumstance. And maybe you could be in that direction of going for a Watkins punt, but it's also arguably 1 week too late. As far as Jackson, I think with the suspension threat gone, with Chelsea playing absolutely awful football whenever Nkunku plays centre forward, he should be starting the next 3 games in the Premier League. There's enough rest. There's no real excuses. I think that they still need performances, and Jackson's more than likely going to give you better performances as the center forward of the team. I still think he's a really reasonable hold if you own him, but would I be investing into him because it would change my team structurally? Probably not. As far as Haaland, he gets a drop once again. The baselines are just poor, right? You can look at it now. He's now inferior to some of the other best picks within the game, and for 14 point something million, it's just not worth it. And yes, of course, the banker, I suppose, would be this Game Week 20 fixture, but he is once again another player that you'd be preparing multiple transfers to get into and then multiple transfers to get out of, and that's not worth it in FPL for me. As far as the defense, moving on to that, Konsa is a new added pick because Pau's injured again. Just a reflection, of course, of how an Aston Villa defender can be quite strong over this run, particularly with a fixture like Game Week 20. So that's why Konsa gets added. Housen gets a bit of a drop. I think you're looking at slightly worse Bournemouth fixtures after this Everton game. The Everton game's, of course, an amazing game, the banker, you'd say. But I do think, yeah, he's going to be someone that's going to be a bit of a soft drop going forwards. Same applies to a lot of the other changes within the defense. What I'm trying to do now is I'm trying to reflect the landscape of FPL, where a lot of people own Gabriel or Trent, or let's say 1 Arsenal defender, even 2 Arsenal defenders plus Trent. And in this landscape, you probably are only going to go for very, very super high upside picks. And I do think that some of the center backs just don't quite cut it, or some of the players really don't quite cut it. So to try and reflect the quality of the price point right now, Castagna and Anderson for me are fantastic. Hall and Munoz are fantastic. So when I'm looking at all these positions and pricing players or moving players up and down, it is a bit of a change of the structure in FPL where I'm starting to see a lot more teams with, let's say, really strong rotation that you can produce from Hall and Munoz. And you have the comfort as well that even someone like Lewis Hall can be played every game. Someone like Munoz can be played every game because his underlying stats are absolutely out of this world. So that is just a reflection of that. And then Fulham have really good fixtures and are a really good defense. So access to their defenders at 4.2 is really good. Not to mention as well that Castagna's underlying stats have been super impressive this season. The more minutes he's played, the better he's looked. And they are playing a sort of hybrid structure where I still will stand by the fact that, or not the fact, but my judgment that Castagna is not 0.6 million worse than Robinson. And he's certainly not 0.8 million worse than Robinson. Robinson has since gotten 2 or 3 price rises since we probably included Castagna to the first iteration of the cheat sheet. Kenny Tete is probably going to come back around Game Week 25 earliest. But it's also possible if you look at last season where if Tete's injured and Castagna is playing really well, which he is, that Castagna can keep his spot within the team. There is a risk there. So obviously Anderson is the alternative pick. I do like Castagna a lot for that reason, and I do think you're still going to get these really good fixtures like the Leicester game, like the Ipswich game, still with Castagna, and that's why I still think he's a very, very high quality pick. And unfortunately, because of this sort of restructuring and some of the sort of moving on of the Nottingham Forest fixtures, I would still drop a Colwill, a Kirkes, a Milenkovic, certainly a Mazraoui and Lewis for these 2 teams that have actually looked pretty poor recently within defense, and that's City continuously shipping out really bad expected goals conceded, versus a team like Leicester. Even though they kept a clean sheet, they did not deserve it. As far as the Man United team, for example, the open play numbers have been good, but the set piece defense is still absolutely horrendous. And you can still see teams targeting, for example, someone like Lisandro Martinez in open play just through aerial duels. And to be honest, there's so many issues going forward with that team. I still think, and Mazraoui's fitness not being amazing, he's just going to get a drop. As far as, let's say, Kirkes, I think he's actually a really high quality pick, but the open play stats are not nearly as good as a Haller and Munoz, and the level of defense is probably not too far apart. As far as Milenkovic, obviously a super high quality defense, but then this is where I also think the fixtures come into play, and that's why Nottingham Forest players get a soft drop. And this applies to Colwell too, where Chelsea's defense just hasn't looked as good as we thought they would, right? When you give a team a good set of fixtures and they absolutely underperform so much, you just have to say that their baselines aren't there and the defense isn't good enough. And so that's why Colwell gets a drop. As far as the next tier of players, Timber gets a drop because he's suspended. Konate gets reintroduced to the cheat sheet because I do think he's going to be coming back soon. We might get a little bit more intel on this through the game, let's say the cup game between game week 20 or 21, or even if he gets to feature, for example, in game week 20. Because keep in mind that unfortunately Joe Gomez is injured with a hamstring issue, and that probably means that Quansah plays 1 or 2 games in the interim, but Konate is an amazing pick if we're looking at the double. As far as Aina, as I said, I think he's gone on so many price rises that he's probably now at a price point where I think maybe he's not worth it. Yes, they've gotten the most clean sheets within the league, but do I still think they're a better defense than Liverpool or Arsenal? Not necessarily, and I still think that they can lose their clean sheets going forward. As far as Guardiola, he gets a drop as well. Just the City defense, the baselines just look too poor. Underlying stats, aren't at the same level, to be quite honest, of a player like Munoz, right? So when I'm looking at Guardiola, and a lot of people will be scared when I watch Guardiola play, am I scared that I sold potentially one of the better attacking picks in the game? Yes, I am. But at the same time, you have to look at the cheat sheet and just look at how many of these players within the cheat sheet are actually producing more in open play compared to Guardiola. And I think that gives you the comfort in knowing that Guardiola probably still isn't one of the better picks within the game, with City being such a poor defense. And they sit right now at 10th in terms of expected goals conceded as a rank almost. And that's it. As far as Trent, I still think, and I always will stand by the fact that to me, he is the best pick in the game from a defensive point of view. If Liverpool are playing like a #1 offense, considering that he should be, as I said, producing extremely good underlying stats. And I remember some discussion a few weeks ago where a lot of people were sort of criticizing that Trent had good chances at the start of the season, then he's dipped off, or overall his level of production has dropped off. But here we are, now we're actually halfway into the season, and his underlying stats this season are closer to they were last season than they were at any point in the season beforehand. And he has maintained a great level of production whilst playing for the best defense or second best defense within the league, and is still the player most likely to get favorable bonus outcomes as a Liverpool defender in any singular game of football. So that for me is the quality of Trent, and that's that. I'm glad he got a 15-point return. I think owners deserved it, probably, particularly those who've been holding for a long time and have been waiting for this return. But I guess a bit of normalcy resumed, and that's it for the cheat sheet, really, because the goalkeepers, the only changes that I'm really making is a drop to Sanchez because the baselines for Chelsea look poor, and Flecken as well, because even though he's back, the fixtures are still pretty much awful for Brentford, at least from a kind of what you're going to expect from an expected goals conceded point of view going forwards and the fixtures. So that's going to be the cheat sheet. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you guys have a wonderful game week ahead, and I'll see you guys soon.